Well, welcome to today's Legacy Project. We're excited to be with you. We have three amazing people that are going to be sharing with you today about the role of a trustee in building a legacy. Excited for all of you. We have so many people from around the nation, different states that are here for today's Legacy Project. As many of you know, we try our best to turn it into a conversation where we have the ability to engage you, allow you to be involved in the discussion, and really make it very interactive. So excited for you to be here. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with us. You know, we were talking behind the scenes as we were preparing for today, and we were talking about what one of our friends and mentors say about the difference between good intentions and being intentionally good. And many of us that work with families and help them plan their legacies and transfer wealth, I believe all of us have very good intentions. Our intentions are good to help prepare this family, to help put in the best technical planning, help make sure that that the grantor or the family's wishes is carried out. But I think there's a big difference between intentionally good and being having good intentions and being intentionally good. And that being intentionally good aspect of it, I think really plays out really important when we talk about the role of a trustee in building a legacy. I think the trustee helps the be intentionally good rather than the good intention aspect of it. So with that said, I'm excited to have today with us Judy Pearson. Judy Pearson's from Nomadic Solutions, an amazing advisor helping advisors make sure that they carry out and protect the trustee and their responsibilities as part of this legacy plan. Also, we have Vanessa Canega, who's also from Interactive Legal, president and content development person there. And then we have Steve Markin, who's the co-founder over at Trustee Services Group. So excited to have you guys with us. Excited to be with each of you on the call today. And Vanessa, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm going to shut my camera off and I'm going to sit back and take notes. So excited to spend time with you guys today.
Thanks, Chad. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Chad said, I'm Vanessa Canega. I'm the President and Director of Content Development for Interactive Legal. I'm really happy to be here with Judy Pearson and Steve Markin, who I had the pleasure of speaking with in our sort of pre-call, and I think we're going to have a great conversation today. Before we go ahead and get started, I want to just mention that we are open to audience questions. Those of you who have been part of attending this series in the past, this will be familiar to you, but in case you're brand new, first of all, welcome. But second, just to let you know, we do take audience questions. We want you to really drive this conversation because we're here to help you and provide you with the perspective that you would like to get out of this discussion today. So if you have questions as we get started, we'll go ahead and start jumping into the discussion here. But as we get going, if you have questions, please post them in the chat panel that you'll see on your GoToMeeting controls. And we will open up your microphone when we call on you to ask your question. We'd like to hear it in your own words and your own voice. So as we get going, once you start sending in your questions, I'll call on you by name. If you could also include where you're from, that way I can kind of distinguish you and say, John from Arizona, that would be helpful. I'll call on you. We'll open up your mic at that point, and then you can ask your question. If you don't happen to have a microphone on your device, please let us know that as well, and I'll just read your question for you. So let's go ahead and get started. Steve and Judy, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm excited.
Me too. I think this will be a really good one. To jump in, I wanted to ask each of you to maybe just give a little bit of background. Chad did a nice introduction and nicely summarized kind of what each of you and your organizations do. But I think each of you fills a unique role in the estate planning sphere and has a unique relationship to this subject. So I wanted to start by just asking you to maybe describe just a little bit more about what you do and how you came to have a perspective on this topic, and maybe talk a little bit about why you think this discussion of legacy planning is important based on the work that you do. So Judy, maybe let's go ahead and start with you. If you could tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you've seen this play out, and why you think legacy planning is important.
So I come at this from a very different perspective and a very technical perspective from risk management. I started in the insurance industry in 1982 handling directors and officers liability insurance, and I'm not going to take you through my whole career, but the importance is when I started in D&O insurance, boards of directors didn't understand the relationship between the board of directors and the shareholders. And it wasn't until Merger Mania that really the structure around roles, responsibilities, fiduciary duty got established. And I believe that trustee liability is exactly where D&O was back in 1982, because there are complex laws that are changing rapidly and often in conflict. And it's important, there's a group of trustees that are extraordinarily well-trained and understand the enormity of the job and the roles and responsibilities, like Steve, but there's a majority of trustees out there who accept the role and they think they understand what their roles and responsibilities are, but they get overwhelmed. And there's a lot of resources available to help them understand what their exposure looks like, how they manage this, what resources can you call on to do the job right, so that the wealth owner really can have the plan implemented as they hoped. So long story, but that's where I am.
No, that's great. Well, and Steve, I'm going to turn to you now, and I'm going to pick on you a little bit, if you don't mind, because when we had our sort of pre-call, I think you had said something like, well, I don't think this audience needs us to tell them about the role of a trustee. And I kind of thought, okay, well, that's going to be a really, really short webinar then. But I think it was obvious, to me at least, what you meant was that this audience is composed of professionals, attorneys, advisors, accountants who know the technical requirements or duties of a trustee that Judy mentioned. And so we don't need to talk about that, and we don't need to go into that in detail, all those legal requirements. But what doesn't get touched upon a lot are the legacy aspects of serving as a trustee. And so that's why we're here today. So if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about your perspective as somebody who both served as trustee and advises trustees, and why you think this is an important discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Vanessa. So my background is I'm a recovered attorney. So I practiced law for many years. And then when I left the practice, I went to work at the corporate office of Pacific Life and ING. And my job there was to serve financial advisors really throughout the country as they look to serve their clients. And then I took another step and went into the area of philanthropy and had just the privilege to work with very, very successful families. And in my various roles in working with, collaboratively working with attorneys, financial advisors, and CPAs, and then collaboratively serving the families that we were to care for, I heard what the families were experiencing. And what the families were experiencing, especially the more wealth they had, the more concerned, not that they were going to have their wealth dissipated due to taxes, because quite frankly, they had the team around them that was taking good care of that. We were on that. But it was more so that the wealth itself would ruin the next generation. And so as I listened and I heard, I unpacked that a little bit more. What does that mean? How is the wealth going to ruin the next generation? And that's certainly, with all the families that we had worked with, that's not the goal. The goal is to make sure that the wealth through the generations is a treasured gift and actually a launch point for good in their life and society. So anyway, that's really what precipitated me to found Trustee Services Group. And what I wanted to do was more focus upon exactly what these clients were saying. What is the challenge that they're having? And what I found was it's not really the legal documents, the traditional legal documents as they had been drafted, which is going to move it to the next generation. But what's missing from those? And it's not really the wealth management. They had that figured out. They already had their team surrounding them and felt very comfortable with that. So what is it? And that's why I think I just love what Chad and this group has been doing with the Legacy Project. This conversation, I think a different type of conversation and a different focus, more on the human capital side of things, is critically important. And now as a trustee, we have the privileged opportunity to oversee really the legacy of those that have gone before. And the way that we're overseeing it is dependent very much so on the legal documents, and certainly wealth management comes into play. But I think that there's certain things that can be done amongst the professional advisory team to better equip the family for generational success.
Well, and it's interesting because you talk about wealth ruining the next generation. And I know, I mean, just from my experience in practice, I saw a lot of that too, that I would have very wealthy clients who were, you know, it was great that we were working to save them transfer taxes. But their concern was, I want to make sure my kids are productive. I want to make sure they're living their life to the fullest and being, you know, doing something good or to fit into their little part of the world. So I think we've all seen that, but I think we've also heard, and we've heard in these discussions, I know there's been a lot of discussion of not just wealth and what it can do to maybe corrupt, for lack of a better word, the next generation, but the fact that there's all these statistics about wealth dissipating by the third generation, I think is sort of the standard, what you hear. And I was wondering if each of you could maybe speak to that. I know from talking to you that you both take a very positive approach, a very, you know, positive, holistic approach to working with families and how can we make sure things are on the right track. But I know you've also both seen some plans that were very carefully crafted that were not on the right track and that were on the track to dissipate that wealth by the third generation. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you have seen things going wrong, how you see the trustee fitting into that, and how you think that taking a legacy approach could maybe help with that, if you do.
Steve, or do you want to start? And then
anyone.
So I would say from what I see is that's a very long and complicated question, right? So we could talk days on it, but I'm going to give you two extremes of what I see. So one piece is when you have a good family structure and people are really trying to understand the family dynamics and the legacy planning and things like that. I still hear a lot of beneficiaries trying to find their voice. And as trying to find their voice, it's a very complicated task for the trustee to be able to help that beneficiary find their voice and be contributing in the way that they want to do it. And I can give a number of examples of where I see it trying to be done well, but still that last generation having challenges. On the flip side, I see situations where the wealth owner still wants to control the situation and not allow the beneficiaries and the trustees and the various other participants in the legacy planning to do their job. So I'll give an example that I was recently involved in and how we were able to help solve it. Although, again, I come from the technical side, it's still the trustee's duty to carry this out. But it was a situation where a wealth owner had appointed a trustee that was very close to the family. In fact, they were business partners. The thought process was the next generation, very close, they love each other, there's never going to be any issues. And they're also very helpful to the family. So one of the family members of the wealth creator, of the company creator, invited his sister in to do a job who turned out to be brilliant and worked her way up to CEO of or COO of a very large international company, but they were also asking her to be the distribution agent, not from a legal context, but from an execution perspective. So you had a situation where the wealth owner was still pulling all the strings and controlling everything. The trustees were not doing their job because they were sitting passive on the line. And you had this individual who had a ton of risk because she had no legal authority, but was acting in a way, and the kids just didn't have the respectful communication. And so we were able to kind of realign everything and kind of explain, the wealth owner didn't want to hear that there were risks or there could be lawsuits or anything. So we were able to characterize it more in a risk of getting the assets back in the estate, and the IRS might have an issue. And for that reason, we had to realign the communication. And once we were able to realign the communication, the process and procedure was better, and the beneficiaries were able to start having better conversations with the trustee. So you have to figure out how to get the wealth owner to understand that the plan was amazing, but he needed to step back and let everybody else do their job to be able to have that legacy. So that's an example of the things I see. So Steve?
Thank you, Judy. And I'm going to piggyback on what you said, and especially from the position that you come from. What I see all too often is that the damage that can be done by naming the wrong trustee.
Mm-hmm.
And the fruit of that can oftentimes be litigation. And that can be incredibly, obviously destructive to the wealth itself, but especially to the family. And where I see that quite a bit is where a family member is named in the role of trustee. You put the family member in the midst of the family wealth, that is just going to tweak the relationships. Let me give you a true story of a case that we're involved with. This was the beneficiary is now a 50-something-year-old adult. He was laid off from a job over a decade ago. Very competent, worked for a tech company, laid off, got a year severance. And so he took full advantage of that severance and just enjoyed life. His dad had died years before, and he then became the beneficiary of a very large trust on which mom was the trustee, okay? So beneficiary goes, laid off, experiences life, traveled the world with his year severance. That all went away. And then he comes back and he basically says, I like this life of leisure. I'm not going to use my talent anymore because I've got a trust. And so I'm going to go to mom and I'm going to tell mom, I can't get a job. Mom, woe is me, support me. Well, he played that tune for over a decade, okay? This wealth that was set up because of dad's unfortunate early departure was now being used to, in the words of mom, who came to us and said, please replace me, ruin her son. Nobody wants the wealth to ruin the next generation. Everybody that I've always worked with, they want the wealth to be a productive launch point for a fulfilled life. Okay, that may look very different for other people, for everybody, but that's ultimately what they want the wealth to do. And so if you put a family member in the midst of that family wealth, it can have horrendous relational impact on that family. And Judy, you probably see this way too much as well. When you get family members fighting over the wealth, common sense goes completely out the door.
Right.
This is personal.
Well,
and they lawyer up and there goes all the wealth. Horrible.
Well, and I've seen that as well. And I completely understand what you're saying, but it is also somewhat counterintuitive to me, right? Because we're talking about the estate plan being a vehicle for the family's legacy, and who better to understand that legacy than a family member, right? You would think that that's the ideal person to fill that role. I mean, putting aside, I'm a trust and estate lawyer and tax geek at heart, and so I always have to say, putting aside the tax issues with having a beneficiary act as trustee, but from a legacy perspective, you would think that that would be the natural fit, is to have a family member. So I mean, why do you think that is? Is it just what you said, that it's personal? I mean, why do you think the family member is not a good fit? And is there a way that if the client is very firm that that's really the best fit, that you can sort of help that family member to serve in that role in a way that will actually, fulfill the estate plan?
Yeah, Judy, if I could take address that first. And Judy said this too, a couple things when she was previously talking: communication and control. And Vanessa, to answer your question, commonly families want a family member to be in the midst of the wealth generationally, because it's their wealth, right? And they want to control that. And your point is very well taken, absolutely. And it does make sense. But when you put them in that place of being decision maker for that family wealth, again, it can be very relationally destructive. So what I will do, I will commonly get this in the estate design process, where attorneys will bring it to us. We're talking with the family, exploring, how they're going to construct their estate. And I'll tell the family, why don't you consider perhaps serving in a trust protector role? And in that trust protector role, what happens is now the family member is the overseer of the job that the trustee is doing. Okay. So now the trustee is going to be reporting to that trust protector, the family member. The nice thing is that when these relational issues may arise, they're not in harm's way. It's the trustee is the one that has to address it, right? And so but just by simply moving the seat of the family member from the trustee to perhaps a trust protector role, you're still going to get them involved, and really they're in control. If this trustee goes sideways, and I think that's what a lot of families are concerned about, they're inviting a trustee into their relationship to oversee their wealth generationally, and across the board they're saying, who is this trustee? So that's why I love the ability, and families love this too. I bring this up all the time. The families love the ability to keep their wealth advisor involved with the next generation. So from a drafting perspective, on the legal side, put that wealth advisor in as perhaps in a directed trustee type fashion, where they are going to be responsible for the wealth management. What that does, again, if you think of this family, they've already made those choices of who they want to be involved with the management of their wealth. Why would that ever change if the wealth is going to move generationally? To my experience, they don't want it to change. Secondly, is that a wealth advisor, if you look at CPAs, financial planners, and attorneys, the unfortunate thing with attorneys is we oftentimes come in on a transactional basis. We don't have that luxury or privilege to walk alongside those clients through the years, generally. But a financial advisor does. And a financial advisor is always working with that family to see, what do you want your wealth to accomplish for you? And then through that, they're also discussing, tell us about the family, right? And that especially goes in the estate design. So when the estate matures and it goes now to the next generation, if the wealth advisor is still a part of that transition to the next generation, that whole family story is not lost. In fact, it continues on. And from a trustee's perspective, that helps us out tremendously, tremendously.
From a conceptual perspective, I agree 100% with Steve. But here's where I think the professionals need to think about things in a different way. So the origination of a trust protector, as an example, was in theory a non-fiduciary role. It was there in case you had to make some changes or do decanting, but that role is expanded. And so oftentimes I hear people say, I'm a trust protector, I don't have a fiduciary role, and I don't have any exposure. However, as that role gets expanded, I think that needs to be thought about much more carefully. In addition to that, it feels like every morning I look at my computer and I hear a new role is being created. So I think the whole idea of whether it's the legal perspective or an execution perspective on doing kind of this directed trust environment, meaning you have professional trustees, you have the professionals who know how to do the investment and they do the accounting, and you either delegate or direct the professionals to do their job. There's lots of roles that the family member can play a part of. I just think it's really important for whether it's a family member, a friend or family, or whomever is appointed to these roles, that they truly understand what they're stepping into. And from a liability perspective, don't go any further than that is. So here, let me give you two examples. One is one of my clients called me up and said, I've just been appointed trust protector, and it happened to be a retired CPA. And he just wanted to do a great job. So he started asking for reports and documents and everything. And I'm like, hold on. You've just expanded your role and you've created liability for yourself. So if you are intentionally doing that, that's awesome. But just make sure you understand what you're doing. I recently, another client of mine had a situation where he was creating a trust for a son who had minor disabilities. And they put together an institutional trustee. Again, all these different things were portioned out to the professionals, but he wanted to make sure that everything was being handled right. So they put him in as a family advisor role. And they told him, look, as this family advisor, you have no liability. The trustee has a liability, the accountant has a liability, what have you. They looked at the documents and he had accepted responsibility for everything. So conceptually, I am a huge proponent of exactly what Steve was saying, but the people who are taking on that roles need to really understand what personal liability they have, what they don't have, and make sure that they can protect themselves. And one last point on that is things are changing so fast and furiously. What wasn't a fiduciary today may very well be a fiduciary tomorrow. And I think that's part of the challenges. So kind of to sum it up, agree 100% conceptually with what Steve is saying, how to have the friends, family involved in the legacy planning piece of it. But the liability is enormous and people don't understand that.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I think oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Just real quickly, I totally agree, Judy. And that's the beauty, Vanessa, of what Interactive Legal does and can help attorneys with, is that as an attorney, you can craft and carve out this estate design any way you want. And so you can create positions that maybe not, that don't have that fiduciary aspect to it. But then others, like you say, Judy, especially if we're going to use template language, they can inadvertently step into a role where now they're looking at all kinds of risk. The other thing I want to share with you, and Judy, you and I talked about this earlier, is that a family may put, let's say, even their estate attorney in that trust protector role, which I think that can be great. Estate attorneys especially understand all the legal mechanics of everything, so they're perfect for that. But a word of warning is that I'm a recovered attorney, and this is all we do now, trustee work. Our insurer specifically includes, for our fiduciary liability insurance, specifically excludes legal work. And I believe that's true on the legal side.
Mhm.
If you are sitting there as an attorney, you have all kinds of malpractice insurance, but be careful. Do you have fiduciary liability insurance? Because those are two completely different things, very closely interrelated, but very, very different. And from a risk perspective, I think in the risk community, they are viewed very differently.
And I agree with you 100%. And that expands not just the lawyer's professional, but the CPAs, the RIAs,
Yes.
family offices, because everybody has to remember, serving as a trustee, you're serving individually. If you put in a corporate entity, you need to be a trust company. And that's where you have to be very careful about what's covered, what's not covered, what liability is getting created, not only for the individual, but the institution. I see a lot of organizations, because of this fee compression and wanting to have a sticky relationship, agreeing to serve in some of these roles. And my recommendation is always walk into it intentionally, understand what it all looks like, because then you know how to manage through it. And you can do it in a whole lot of different ways, but each one comes with a different set of risks and liabilities. So absolutely.
I have a story. I like to say that it's the most prudent thing you can do is keep the optics clean.
Mhm.
Do not step into a position where there appears to be conflicts of interest. Okay, because it's just the appearance of a conflict of interest that can open the door to litigation, whether in fact there was anything nefarious going on there. It doesn't matter. You're now in litigation. And I have a story of a client that, which is so common, they wanted to name they didn't want a family member to name in there because they had some blended family, all kinds of relational issues that they could clearly see. So they went to their financial advisor and said, would you do this for us? And the financial advisor was then named in the estate, and then the client died. Well, all kinds of problems arose. The family members and the financial advisor had never done it before. So there was some delay in correspondence, the importance of communication, delay in correspondence, which heightens the suspicion. One of the family members lawyers up, now it's done. And they lawyer up, and now the lawyer just starts to make all these allegations that this financial advisor who was managing the assets is doing all these things to generate fees on the financial advisement side. The optics were bad. The optics were bad. The financial advisor hadn't really done anything. In fact, hadn't done anything, right? So they hadn't done anything wrong, but the optics were bad. If you change that up and you put in a third party that does not make money on the investment management of those assets, the optics are clean, okay? And so now if you have a disgruntled beneficiary going to an attorney, the attorney looks at that and says, what's the problem here? And what they do is they ask for a report. If there's a report, an accounting, that should calm down the waters. So keep the optics clear. My suggestion is, perhaps not surprisingly, for families and advisors to find what I call an open architecture trust company. Attorneys draft.
Well, and I know that's your model. I was going to ask you if you could kind of explain what that means a little bit more.
Yeah, what that means, a trustee, there's really three general responsibilities of a trustee. One is overseeing the investment management of the trust assets. Two is, of course, the tax reporting. And then three is the distributions. Those are the three general roles of a trustee. Vanessa, as you well know, comment on the legal side, you can carve out who's responsible for all those things. And so we already talked about that the directed trust, Judy referred to delegated trust. And delegated, the difference between those two is simply that with a directed trust, in the trust document itself, there's a wealth advisor that is fiduciarily responsible for just the investment management. They're not responsible for the tax reporting on the trust, and they're not responsible for the distributions. Delegated just means that the trustee has decided to delegate that responsibility to an outside advisor. So you can carve out those different roles and responsibilities. Where I see perhaps the most difficult and fraught with danger position is that of a distribution trustee. Because you think of it from a beneficiary's perspective, what do they want? They want the money. And where these things can oftentimes arise is, I call it, where you have an ill beneficiary. So somebody that's saying, let's say, is on a path of self-destruction, either because of substance abuse, or perhaps it's just this spending pattern that's unsustainable, right? The trust was designed specifically to guard against that. So now you have a beneficiary that's saying, feed me, right? And the trustee is saying, we can't, you're hurting yourself. There's the rub. That's why, again, you don't want a family member in there, because that's gonna really destroy that relationship. You want that third party that's gonna take that stand on behalf of the family, because the family, again, doesn't want this person to be self-destructive and take a very, very difficult stand, but it's necessary. It's a necessary stand. So to me, that's where a lot of liability can arise on that distribution side.
Right.
So
Well,
one-
and I was thinking that as, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that I was thinking about your comment about not having the family member in the role of trustee, but putting them in a different role. I think that's, to me, as an attorney, I can, and I'm sure as a recovered attorney, as you put it, you can relate to this as well, that sometimes I think that's a very important function of an attorney, right? And we'll use that a lot of times if a client is saying, you know, I know my kids are really going to want to do X, Y, and Z, but I just don't think that's the best thing to do. We say, well, let me be the bad guy, right? I can be the bad guy. Oh, I'd really love to do this, but my attorney has advised against it. You know, you can sit down with the family and have that discussion of like, look, I know mom really wanted to do this for you, but I've told her it's not a good idea. You know, I would really counsel against that. So I can see that, I can see how a more independent trustee in that role could serve kind of the same function. I do, and I'll come back to you, Judy, but we did get a question that I think is very relevant here, and I think is a really interesting question. This is Barry from Chicago. Barry, if you are on, I know you said you may not be able to speak, but if you are on and would like to ask your own question, I'll give you a chance here in a moment. All right, if not, I'll go ahead and ask you because I do think it's a really good question. He says, my duty as an attorney is to the client. If I'm named as a trustee or a quasi-trustee, I think meaning, you know, a quasi-fiduciary, right, in a trust protector role or something of that nature, doesn't my duty of loyalty now switch to the beneficiaries? And I think that kind of gets to the conflict of interest to some extent, like you were talking about, Steve. I wonder if you could speak to that, if you've seen that before and how that might come up and if there's a way to kind of resolve that.
Judy, you want to go ahead and address that?
So I think absolutely, and I don't know if I look at it as much as of a conflict of interest as a shift in the skill set. Because the skill set starts out with the attorney protecting the wealth owner. And as soon as they now become a trustee, their duty of loyalty is to the beneficiary, yet they've probably heard for 10, 20, 30 years the challenges about that individual or the family members or what they're concerned about. And I think it's a skill set that has to be honed. And I think the same issue is whether you're the investment advisor or the CPA, everybody has their own skill set that they have to broaden in order to serve in that role. So I think you're absolutely right that the duty of loyalty shifts. And the other thing that I was going to say is, again, in agreement 100% of the things that we're saying. But the challenge is with the enormous amount of wealth that's getting transferred over the next few decades, there aren't enough experienced trustees to take on that role. So it's part of the reason why a lot of these trusted advisors are being asked to serve in this role. So the question is, what do we need to do to help all these folks support this situation? So if you're a lawyer, maybe you get teamed up with, a professional trustee who's been through all of these things, or maybe you have the accountant who knows how the difference between, the different accounting standards or what have you. But I think it's a challenge. I think Steve's model is absolutely correct, but I don't think that there's enough really good trustees to serve in that role. So it's a whole educational and expansion piece that we have to be looking at. And I think that's part of why the wealth owners are choosing some of these close relationships to help serve in this.
I want to ask, is there something we can do as the estate planning community to sort of bring about more professional, trained trustees who are better able to serve in this role?
Yeah, there are a number of organizations that are trying to do this, and it's a start. It's not a finish. But there's the Independent Trustee Alliance. There's a guy out of New York who's trying to create a platform. So I think there's a movement for this, but we have a long way to go. Even what I try and do in my own business, when I talk about identifying the risk and mitigating the risk, these are the same things that we're talking about. What are the risks? What resources can we bring to bear to help you do a better risk management? And then what you can't manage from a risk perspective, then you transfer. So there's people who are getting pretty amazing accounting systems. And so there's a lot of movement, and that's what I think we need to continue. And part of what I love about the Legacy Project, so I'm just going to give a thing. It is such an enormous business right now, and if we all work together and collaborate, we can find a solution to this. My concern is if we don't get the trained trustees and we don't get the trained advisors in these subtle risk characteristics, that the industry is going to blow up before we can professionalize it. And I don't mean to say it's not professional. I'm just saying because of the growth, we have to catch up to the growth, and we have to catch up to the changing legal system.
Yeah, I think
that's right.
It's a great answer there, Judy, and thank you for bringing up those organizations. I would add another organization, Purposeful Planning Institute.
Yes, sorry.
Colorado here. And I bring up Purposeful Planning Institute because, again, it goes back to what I earlier said. I think the real issue and concern for families of affluence as they're passing it through the generations is much more on the human capital side of things. So that ability to successfully work within these different relational contexts is critically important. And so at Trustee Services Group, we love to take on either financial professionals or attorneys that want to have a career as a trustee. But what we look for is that relational skill set. We can handle the legal stuff and we can handle the administration stuff. That's what a good back office does. That's not the issues that the families are faced with. And the other thing is that we look for, Judy, you brought this up earlier, it's collaboration. So a trustee, so Vanessa, you asked what our open architecture model is. Our open architecture model, it allows for the family to designate who their wealth advisor is. We do not manage wealth. We never have and we never will. we want the family to be able to involve whoever they want in the management of that wealth. It creates a clean optic, I like to say. I think a third party should be occupying that distribution seat. We're huge proponents of the trust protector, whoever that may be, and it could be a blend, a family member and an attorney, because I think there's positives of both. I don't think either one is the perfect solution. And then, of course, there's the accounting aspect of things, and we have the infrastructure for that. But we always use the CPA that has been involved with that family if they can adequately prepare the trust tax returns. We do that because they, like the financial advisor, have that family story. So that's what our open architecture is. We have that view of it's the family's wealth. They should be able to position whoever they want in those various roles. And so I think that's critically important for advisors to do.
Well, and we actually had a couple of questions from audience members about the open architecture structure. So I'm glad that you brought that up, but I want to just open it up to them. If we could start with Jim from Colorado. Is there anything further? Did that answer your question, or did you want to dive into that a little bit more?
Well, thank you, Vanessa. I think Steve did answer what my question was, and that was the key thing is I was a financial advisor for years, and you see the assets leave your own responsibility after you serve the client well and go to an independent trust, and they're managing it, and they don't have a history, they don't have anything, and so we're out of the picture. And I love Steve's model as he described it, where after I've served that client for all of this time, I can still continue to serve that family even after my client I served passed away, because they're important to me. We have a relationship. We want to continue to do that. So I love that model.
Thank you, Jim. And I can experience that that works so well on the trustee's seat. To have that advisor's knowledge of that family helps us to immediately step in there and serve that family well. And then when we get into these sticky points, that story I shared about the woman mom who ruined her son, of enabling him with these trust distributions over a decade, the mom and the advisor and I were all on that same page. We need to relaunch this guy. He's fully capable. We need to relaunch him. We're in close communication with all of those units, family, layers of family, advisor, wealth advisor, but we're the bad guy. And so as we're drawing these lines that mom didn't have the heart or fortitude to do, we're keeping them all apprised. He's complaining, he's got his dialogue going with the financial advisor. It's a healthy dialogue with the financial advisor who's on our side. I don't care if we're the bad guy. I just care that he's having a dialogue with somebody and we're doing the right things to get him relaunched. So it's a beautiful, from experience, it is a beautiful model that the families really benefit from.
Well, and we had another question, and I apologize, Arthur. This is Arthur from Connecticut, because I think I can kind of see where your question, Arthur, had asked, how does the open architecture trustee structure relate to the trust protector? And I think I can kind of see what he's asking, and I think that's what you're getting at. I guess what I was wondering is, when you say you work with the financial advisor, I mean, are you talking about a directed trust situation where the financial advisor is serving as an investment advisor, or are you talking, or in some capacity like that, or are you talking about a more informal, or not informal, but a relationship where you're fully vested with authority as the trustee, but you're just engaging the other professionals to provide their services?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're involved in a lot of irrevocable trusts that have been funded for some time. Okay. And I would say a vast majority, easily probably 98, 99% are not directed trusts. The directed trust is a relatively new thing here in this country. Okay. And so in those type of trusts, we engage the financial advisor to manage it. And it's in a delegated trust type context. In fact, there's great opportunity for you wealth advisors that are out there where you're dealing with the client's retirement assets, their non-qualified assets, and yet you have your client, that same client that has a trust that's being managed away. There is a way to bring it home over to you. And from the beneficiary's perspective, it makes all the sense in the world. They've selected you to manage all their wealth. Why should you not be managing their trust wealth as well? And they love that. So there is ways to move it from one trustee to an open architecture model. We've gotten really good at that. But in the irrevocable trust context, a vast majority of them are in that delegated trust or delegated investment advisor model. On the deferred clients, so these are people that are putting their estates together. What will commonly happen is we're brought in by either by the wealth advisor or the attorney. Because what we always ask, just show us your instructions, you know, what you want to accomplish with your estate. We want to be able to see it just so that we understand the instructions, so that when you pass, that we're not going to the court and thinking, you know, what did that say? What did you mean? So when we do that, we then get, and Vanessa, this goes to what you were saying before, as they're structuring this, so oftentimes they will talk about maybe putting a family member in there, right? That's where we'll have these conversations in this deferred structure. And I can tell you, when I bring up having that investment advisor go be involved with the next generation, easily 95% of the time, the families want that. The 5% that they don't is simply because the next generation, the family knows they already have a wealth advisor that they're already doing well with. But if you think, if you present that to the client, and that's the key, how do you present it to the client? But if you present that to the client, my experience is the clients want that. The other thing is that when we talk about that family member, you know, maybe moving their seat, again, a vast majority of them want to be in control. They immediately get the relational harm that can be done if they're tasked with that responsibility. And sadly, it's because they've lived through it themselves. Our clients have all lived through the settlement of a family member's estate, most likely. And there are way too many stories on the street where that has been just so absolutely destructive. So then when we talk about that, moving their seat to that trust protector role, they seem to like that. But the key is, again, now we need to bring back the attorney. And the attorney, we need attorneys, we need good estate attorneys that can draft in these different ways, that can really structure these different responsibilities, roles and responsibilities. That's what the families want. And that's what really helps position, I think, these estate plans for generational success.
Yeah, and I think to Judy's point from earlier, I mean, that is an ever evolving field. And I mean, I know because we have the challenge of keeping up with it. And for example, you talk about directed trust being relatively new in this country, and that's true. But I mean, I've seen directed trust for, a decade now, but yet we just got the Uniform Directed Trust Act by the Uniform Law Commission. I think it was last year or the year before. So that just goes to show you how, now we have maybe a little bit more certainty as states start to adopt that or continue to adopt that. But people have been doing this for a while without really having such settled law in that area. So I think that just goes to, these are great techniques, but, make sure that you know what you're doing. You're working with a good attorney, or if you're an attorney, you're working with somebody like Judy or with you, Steve, to know all the parameters of it and what you need to do to manage your risk. Judy, we have a couple of questions, and I think they may be best directed at you, although Steve, of course, you're welcome to jump in, but they relate to sort of the professional trustee and finding a trustee who's really the best fit to serve in that role. We have a couple of questions, and I think they both said that they don't have microphones, so I'll just read them for them. One has to do with your thoughts on a financial institution or corporate trustee serving in the roles we've been talking about, whether it's trustee or trust protector, just because there are a lot of, this question says many have been involved in the management side, but we see some corporate trustees focusing on the true administration of trust and whether that's a good idea. And then there was another question specifically about charitable trustees in the philanthropy area, whether without naming this person says without naming any specific charity, are there any that, any philanthropic trustees that you know of that are a good fit if somebody has philanthropic motivations?
Well, again, that's a really big question. So my overarching position on everything is hire the professionals to do what they're good at. So when we talk about a trust company, for some families, it's a good fit to have one of the larger full service trust companies. For other families, it's better to have an administrative trust company. So I think it gets back to kind of what Steve was talking about, sitting down with the family members to say, what is it and how do we want to structure it best? And once we have that piece in place, we can find the appropriate professionals. I think the philanthropy piece of it has really been interesting recently because, again, that's a changing market. And some of the organizations, I don't think people particularly understand the depth of what these folks are doing and how much they take over. So in my view, if we can get the professionals to do the right job and everybody understands everybody's role and responsibility and there's enough communication, we can find the right institution to help them out, if that makes any sense. So if it's a philanthropy question, we have to they need to understand what it is that they want to support and how they want to get it supported. And then it's the lawyers to draft what's the tax implications and all those pieces. So if we hire the professionals, we know why we're doing it, and then put the right structure in place, I think it's good. And I will also say that it changes so fast. And you have to, I think part of the trust protector role, for example, is to have somebody, which is why lawyers are good to be there, because it's a continuing, entity. If it's a large enough law firm, that when things change, that they have somebody in place that can make those changes.
Yeah.
The philanthropic side is a very unique and I think underutilized area of practice. In having, with my experience, we've been very involved in that philanthropic space for a long time, and we have a pretty deep bench within our firm. But what I found in working with these families, high net worth families, 90% of them have a family foundation of some type, either a donor advised fund or a private foundation, perhaps a supporting org. Those are unique and complex animals in and of themselves. So it's really important to have somebody that understands that. But boy, if you get somebody that understands that, there is so much opportunity to use that vehicle to bring the family together, to have a values-based conversation, which is exactly what this legacy project is all about. What I so oftentimes see is, or what's so interesting about philanthropy, is I can find out all kinds of things about somebody when I ask, what do you want to give to? That is the quickest way to get a peek into somebody's heart. And if you just get a peek, don't stop with a peek, dig. And you're going to hear some incredible stories of folks. And we've been involved in this multi-generationally, where the foundation is used intentionally as that center point to bring the generations together, to have that conversation about what do you care about, right? That fits naturally in the philanthropic space, maybe not so naturally in the tax, financial, or estate space. It is perfect right within there. And there's nothing more reflective of somebody's values than their giving. The other thing that we learned from experience is the interesting thing, the more wealth you have, the more likely it is that the next generation will choose to do nothing with their life. And that is the issue that the wealth creators have. And that's what they want to make sure that their wealth does not enable them to do nothing. And the other thing is materialism. If you have a beneficiary that suffers from materialism, that will eat up that family wealth quicker than anything. And they got to get on that. A way to counteract that is philanthropy. You think about philanthropy, and money has no character. It has no character at all. It depends upon the hands in which it's put. And so if you have somebody that's suffering from materialism, they want that money and they want to use it all for themselves. What's philanthropy? This money is not for me, it's for others. It's the opposite side of the same coin. And so if you can fuel that, what is it that you really care about? What's the difference legacy that you want to have? When your life is all said and done, what is it that the mark that you want to leave on those around you, if not the world? And how is that mark made? It's not made by this personal consumption of the wealth. It's made on how you've used that wealth to benefit others. And that uniquely fits within that philanthropic space. So I am sorry that we got this question right at the end, because I will fill up a whole hour on that.
I just want to always add that other side, though. I agree 100% with what Steve is saying, but a lot of the structures that are presented to the family, like the donor advised funds, like the, community funds, they can get really complex, and they can be product driven, not legacy driven. And the trick is to train that next generation, get them involved. Like when I opened up my comments, it's about helping that next generation find their voice, because I'm in the middle from a liability perspective in a number of claims where there's this conflict of what Gen 1 thought that they wanted, what Gen 2 is doing, and what Gen 3 wants to do now, because things are changing. So again, I agree 100%. That's exactly where it needs to be, but these structures are complex. You need to really understand it. There needs to be a flexibility, and there needs to be a understanding of how to reduce that conflict.
Well, and even more reason why the sort of open conversation is so important, because, we've all seen this on all sides, whether it's the legal side, the financial side, what have you, is the client, has been to cocktail parties, they've talked to their friends, and now been on Zoom calls, Zoom cocktail parties, and they come to you and they say, I want a donor advice fund, right? Because they've heard of that, they know it sounds good, it works very well for their friends, I want a donor advice fund. But unless you sit down and really have the conversation about, okay, what are you trying to achieve with that? Let's make sure we can do that for you, but let's make sure that's the best way to achieve your goals. And it may not be, right? So you have to start with that conversation of what are you trying to achieve to make sure that you're putting the right thing in place, because otherwise you may be getting into a really complex, risky endeavor that is not even serving the family's goals. And I want to I think that's a good place to sort of pivot, because in the last little bit of time that we have here, I want to kind of bring it back to talking about, I think we've really hit on all of the very good reasons to have this conversation about legacy planning and what is your legacy, and how it not only, helps to actually fulfill the goal of the estate plan, but can help to, I hope you would both say, maybe even minimize risk for the fiduciaries involved if they really understand the goal of the plan. That, I think, one of the hardest aspects of this is having that conversation, right? Because it can just be a very personal, difficult conversation to have, but also just it's hard to really express what you're trying to get at when you're asking these questions. And I like your idea, Steve, about asking about philanthropy, because that really does open up what are what do you care about? You know, and I think that could be a very effective way to open that conversation. But I was wondering if each of you could talk about some of the tools that you use or that you've seen that might be available to advisors to kind of help families and their fiduciaries open up this conversation.
Yeah, I'll address that. It's a great question. Two things. One is in these legacy project calls that we've had, we've heard through some of these calls, we've heard the letter of wishes, I think, legacy letter, those things. That is, from a trustee's perspective, critically important. It takes a gift that can be viewed as something that they're entitled to. It changes it from an entitlement type of view to this is an investment. And these letter of wishes really explain, they go on and they provide the flavor behind the legal stuff. And it really gives that, if properly drafted well, it gives that, that personal touch, explaining why it is that they're going to invest their wealth in this next generation, the story behind it. So to me, that's and we're named in hundreds of estates on a deferred status. I don't know, maybe there's one or two that have that. So we're going to be going and doing we're going to team up with Susan Turnbull. In fact, she might be a great prospect for a call. And she has some, I think, some great material to create these letter of wishes documents. So we're teaming up with her to help our clients to create that. The other thing is that, again, in all these calls, what I've heard is that I think many of us on these calls are on that same page. We want to help. We want to go down this more human capital side of things, not discounting at all the technical. It's critically important, but I think we got that pretty well covered, right? We got some great practitioners here and elsewhere, but what about that human capital side of things? And so I've been around for a while, and there's the Purposeful Planning Institute has exposed me greatly. There's another, the Heritage Institute, which was a group out of Portland, Oregon, created by an attorney, Rod Zeeb, estate planning attorney. And it was this coaching program that would help advisors go down there and really help to counsel the clients multi-generationally and bring them together. So influenced greatly by all those things. But what I say, I come things from, of course, a trustee perspective. And I think in the estate space, it is about legacy. It is all about legacy. And that is going to be our final statement. What are we going to be remembered by the next generation for? We write that book that's all our life, but that is going to be the final statement, our estate plan. So when we talk about legacy, I think there's nothing that fits so squarely within that legacy space as an estate plan. But what I see, and I've worked with attorneys and financial advisors all around the country for years. And as I created this thing that I'm going to talk about, it's called the Personalized Estate Design Tool. And we've created it we basically give it away. We charge our cost, and we've created it for financial advisors and estate attorneys to use. And what it does, what financial advisors and estate attorneys will quickly get into is the assets. And here's how the estate conversation goes. Client comes in, they want a product. They say, give me the product, the estate plan. The attorney says, tell me about you. What is it that you want to accomplish, right? And the client says, well, what does everybody else do? And that's how it goes.
Right.
It's a good conversation. And now an estate plan is put together that looks like a lot like everybody else's. But what we don't have is, why don't we back up the bus? And why don't we ask them their experience with wealth? How were they influenced by wealth in their own life? And then we've heard this all the time in our legacy project, the 5 capitals. I can't tell you how important that 5 capitals are. So this process, what it does is it will ask the client, after we ask these questions, or the advisor asks the questions, tell us about your experience with wealth. Now what we do is we get the advisor to ask them about the 5 capitals. Rank those in order of importance. And I've done this for years. And the answer is always, if the person is a person of faith, their spiritual capital will be number 1. But if across the board, what always happens, the human capital and intellectual capital is almost always above the financial capital. And the reason why, this guy explained it. He said, because if I don't have the character, if the character is corrupt and they're an idiot, that will always have a negative impact on the wealth. But if you have good character, and if they're an idiot, you can help get advisors around them to help them get through that idiocy, let's say. But the character is such an important thing. And if you have good character, you may lose the wealth, but you always have an opportunity. Okay, so it's so interesting that the human capital, intellectual capital is always above the financial capital. And what I think about, especially because we're all a bunch of attorneys and financial advisors and CPAs on this call, what are we focused upon? Financial capital. So this is a tool that guides the family through this process. And then what they do, once they identify their 5 capitals, then you take them through and name the heirs, and now rank them with those 5 capitals. Now we're discovering, who are these people? And then that gives rise to, how should we structure this estate so it is beneficial to them and not harmful? So we got to ask different questions before we get into, how are we going to move the puzzle pieces which are the wealth. So that's a tool that we've created. As fortune would have it, we launched it in February, and then COVID hits, or January COVID hits. So we're going online with it. Again, it's a tool that we have created specifically for advisors to use. You guys have those relationships. Let's use it in a better way, I think, to better position these families to transition their wealth through the generations.
And is that going to be an online platform that advisors can use? How can people access that if they're interested?
Yeah, well, we can share with Chad in the group of our training that we'll have. It's a kit, and we hold your hand every step of the way. Not to give too much, but we even have a brochure that kind of cues it up for them. They say, yes, that's me. I've got that complexity. Then it pushes them back to the advisor. And then the way we launch it, just to give you a little glimpse, we have this suggested letter that the advisor sends out to the client. And this is what begins this process. The advisor says, basically, come back, bring 5 photos that are important to you. And when you have that done, and then here's the first part of this personalized estate design. Here's these questions about your experience with wealth. When you've answered those questions, come back with your 5 photos. And now we're going to begin a conversation. So it's a turnkey kit that we've created for these advisors to use. That piece of it, where it's the 5 photos, just immediately takes them on a different type of journey than they're used to, and creates an intimacy in the process that I think is sorely or is much needed for success.
Well, I love that. I love giving them something tangible to focus on, because, you know, we all have different learning styles and different styles of engagement, and people love to talk about themselves. So I think that's most people do, at least. I think that's a good way to focus. Judy, what about you? Have you seen any really effective tools out there, or anything that you've come up with or that you use to kind of start or lead these conversations?
So I don't really try and participate in those roles. I'm usually, here on just really the technical side of it. But I'm glad that Steve mentioned PPI as an example. I mean, they have amazing family dynamics people out there. And I think the folks who play in that family dynamic space are phenomenal in trying to get to some of these issues. So I would use them as a resource for sure. I think, Steve, I would say every top family dynamics person in the country is part of PPI, don't you think?
Oh, for sure.
I would see PPI as resource for the top folks in that. I mean, I've got names that I'd be happy to give, but that's just not my role. I don't try and get into that. But it's an enormously important part of the estate plan.
The great thing about PPI, which is exactly what Chad is doing and the group is doing here at the Legacy Project, it's intended to be collaborative, and it is collaborative. I think that we all come from it from different perspectives. I love the fact that Judy and I were on this panel together because we're looking at the same thing, but with a little different optic. But when we come together as practitioners, financial, legal, tax, and if we can collaborate in this kind of open architecture environment, what happens is good. It's really good. And who does it benefit? The family. And I can tell you from experience, we all have this too. The families of affluence want that. I think that's exactly why this family office concept grew so tremendously, because these families of affluence, they've got a lot of plates that they're juggling out there. The most important thing to them, though, is their family. And that's what we're dealing with. Very busy people, when we're constructing their estate or their legacy plan, it's about their most treasured asset. It's their family. And so how do we bring cohesiveness to all these things? Collaboration is hugely key.
It's actually interesting as we kind of go through this. As I say, every day I look at my computer and I see a new role. I'm starting to see the beneficiary advocate role, which is really interesting, which is a third-party person that will listen to the beneficiary and help raise their voice and watch over what the estate plan looks like. Because again, so often it is a top-down, the wealth owner, what their legacy is, what have you. So it's a whole new shift in thought process. And I've seen it now 3 or 4 times, mostly on the East Coast. So again, the collaboration, and I encourage everybody to be listening to this piece of it too, because again, from the risk analysis, I think the one thing that Steve said early on that I agree with, the litigation comes about because of the family dynamics. They find the technical reasons to sue, but it's all about communication and hurt feelings. So it's a very interesting, evolving industry.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that, Judy, because I was thinking that earlier. Somebody made a comment, or I think one of you shared a story about a beneficiary who just really kind of didn't want to go along with the plan, and I had this thought that it's sort of like, I'm a step parent, and my stepson is grown now, but I remember when he was a teenager, we would try to impose all these rules on him because we thought he should be doing certain things to achieve certain goals. And at the end of the day, I realized I had to work with him as who he was, because trying to just impose my own values on him and my goals on him just was never going to get anywhere. If you have to approach the beneficiary. I think it's the same thing with the beneficiary. I think that's a good analogy for it. You have to approach the beneficiary where they're coming from, because the grantor may have very specific goals that they've structured into that estate plan. But if the beneficiary is going to fight those goals all the way, you're really never going to get anywhere, and it's going to make that trustee's job very difficult. So I think that's really interesting that you're seeing this sort of beneficiary advocate role, because I think that can be a very important part of making the plan actually work well. I think we probably need to wrap things up and draw things to a close, but I noticed that Dan Scott, who's one of the sort of co-founders of the Legacy Project, was having some technical difficulties earlier, and so I don't think he's going to be able to get his video to work, but I know that he has a note that he would like to say specifically about the topic of collaboration. So Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm sorry, I do have technical difficulties still, but you can hear me, correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Just on the topic, as you were talking about collaboration and different advisors from expertise and things coming together and working together for clients, what I wanted to stress was, when we talk about legacy planning and one of the goals of the legacy project in terms of really ushering in sort of a new way of practice and thinking about planning, is that collaboration really should be built into, sort of forced into the plan, right? When we do at Spotlight, legacy planning, and we design a plan, the different components that we sort of simplified this down to in terms of what is a legacy plan, starts with kind of purpose or manifesto, as we call it. But the other components, the other 4 components, are really around how to bring that purpose to life. And those 4 components are assets or wealth, meaning financial, human, and then what we call creative. But so, looking at what do you have to work with in order to accomplish your legacy, your purpose, and again, to proactively live it, right? Because the legacy you leave is really the life you live.
Yeah.
But the second component is where we start getting into the collaboration, and that's the team. Team is necessary. So identifying which team members are critical, prioritizing when and how to bring them in, is all part of what should be considered. This is why I want to move away from a traditional estate plan to a legacy plan. Attorneys and people that are drafting these, or the architecture of these plans, need to think about team and who's necessary. The third part of that is structure. How is all of this owned, operated, and controlled? And part of that structure is exactly how is that team, right? How does that team work together within this framework? So this is all sort of, we need to move away from just looking at wills and trusts and thinking about this as really a broader architecture that builds in, takes these legal vehicles, if you would, and applies them into a broader architecture. And then finally, its process is, how does this work together on a continuing, ongoing basis? Because the biggest mistake I've always felt that traditional estate planning makes is the idea that you're done, right? Here's your document, here's your trust, and I now my affairs are in order and I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And all that you have done at that point is really create the starting line, right? That now you can actually begin to do, now you can live your estate plan or live your legacy plan. But the issue of collaboration is so critical to the client's success. The idea of a team working collaboratively to propel that client forward, for them to live their best life, to find personal fulfillment and joy, and also to propel the family forward. That is something that is not an option and needs to be thought of, and the client needs to be told. And we as an industry, collective industry, need to impress upon clients that planning is not getting a will or getting a trust. It is a much larger undertaking, particularly for families of affluence.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to stress that point, because when we talk about collaboration, and even things like family values, and a lot of what has been, I think, inappropriately deemed the softer issues, because quite frankly, they are the harder ones to deal with. We have not, as again, as a collective industry, built those issues into necessary issues that have to be addressed and have to be planned around. It sort of remains optional, right? And it remains that, well, the exceptionally good trust companies and the exceptionally good wealth advisors and the exceptionally good estate attorneys, well, they happen to do that as part of their practice. We need to usher in a different industry standard where this is part of planning. Who's your team? Who's your process? How's it working together? How are we going to collaborate? That has to be decided in advance and implemented. So that was my 2 cents.
Dan, I'd like to, everyone, hi, my name's Chad, if you haven't been on there, and I promise you I'm your friend. But I do want to add to this, Dan, that what you just said, and I think what everyone is sharing, how important it is that if we're not preparing on the front end, we will 100% be repairing on the back end. And as advisors, I truly believe that we have to be intentional with the preparing on the front end. And sometimes at least in my practice and how we've developed over the last two decades. I can't believe I'm doing this almost 20 years now. But I realized that where it went wrong for me and the families we worked with was when I wasn't thinking through it well in the beginning, so that I didn't have to repair it on the other side with the family. And someone, I don't remember who said this, but someone had alluded to the conversations and the difficult conversations. And my wife and I, Danielle, we had a coach many years ago, and he said this to us. He said, I love you too much to allow you to continue to do this to yourself.
Yes.
And as advisors and as people that are helping the family steward that wealth, I believe that we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable so that we can give the family the best possibility to have this legacy plan that they really have, these thoughts, these visions, because these families, they want something special for their future generations and even for themselves to say that I did something of significance, right? But sometimes it takes an advisor who can see something that they can't see and then gets out of their comfort zone to be able to guide that family to that legacy plan that they have in their mind, but they haven't necessarily been able to carry out in real life yet.
Chad, it truly takes a village. What we're dealing with is wealth, legal structures, tax, and people. And truly to think that any one person or entity can handle it all is foolish.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Dan, to your point too, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you've said. Collaboration is so key. And to start thinking in that way as planners, how should we be designing this? What is that village that this family needs for generational success? The other thing I don't want us to lose sight of, Dan, that you made another comment that I want to highlight. I think it's absolutely true. When you create, instead of an estate plan, when you create a legacy plan, you are identifying, helping that family to identify what does my life want to stand for, and what do I want to do generationally for those I love. Mm-hmm. If you don't identify that, you're going to miss it. And so, Dan, you said, and I agree wholeheartedly, when you take that legacy design perspective, it's not the end. That's just the beginning.
Yep.
What it is probably the first time that the family has ever sat down and really thought, this is going to be my legacy. Okay? So it is, when people walk through that door wanting to do an estate plan, I just challenge everybody, stop, create a legacy plan, take that legacy perspective, and understand this. This is the door to a whole new relationship, a whole new perspective. And it's the beginning of what will be a lifelong journey that will continue on after them. Mm. So once you get to help them to identify, now we can start working toward it. And I can tell you over and over again, I see this so many times, and you have too. What we have is we have G1 that has worked hard and sacrificed a lot to create that wealth. The sacrifice that they have made oftentimes has created some relational fractures through the generation, just because they have not been as present as they would have liked. And what we have is we have hurt within the generational family. And across the board, they want that to heal. Okay? If you do a legacy plan, you will discover this stuff. And then, to Dan, your point, let us begin the journey today of healing. Because what a shame it is that person passes and we didn't work towards it. So identify it by getting out of the estate plan, instead focus on a legacy plan. Now when the legacy plan has been identified, now let's begin to help the generations to have that success today that will last them through the multiple generations, well beyond 3.
Yeah. Well, this was, I want to thank you, Vanessa. I think you did a phenomenal job of leading the discussion. I know it's not easy. We want to be respectful. We have about a minute left, but But thank you so much for really facilitating this conversation today. I think it was tremendously valuable for so many advisors. Judy, Steve, appreciate both of you tremendously. I think you poured out your heart. You share a tremendous amount of years of wisdom with these advisors. For those of you that are on the call, or those of you that'll be watching this from our YouTube channel, I'd encourage you, one, to know that the Legacy Project's mission is really 3 areas. It's 3 C's. It's community, it's conversation, and it's collaboration. This part of it is one of the C's, which is the conversation. I want to encourage you, if you can, take these conversations and bring them into your conference room, or take these conversations and bring other advisors that you work with into it, and do it in your community. One of the things that Dan Scott and I, as we were really thinking about what this looks like as a movement, was to be able to take this to cities. And we didn't know when, obviously we were building this out before COVID, and we didn't realize that we would have to go virtual. But the goal really is to take you and that person that's in Texas and have you having these conversations there, and even using these conversations as part of a discussion in your conference room, not with us even there, just playing it and stopping it and discussing it. But I would encourage you to do that wherever you are in the country. Bring some advisors together, because when you do that, there's this level of impact that you can make when you're working with like-minded people. And that doesn't mean that you'll have to agree on everything. It just means that we agree that we believe that families should have a legacy, and we can help them and guide them towards it. How we get there, we can discuss that. We may not even see it 100% the same way, but as long as we can agree that winning looks like a family living their legacy and building it with intentionality, we can do this. This is not an easy task, but I believe all of us have the ability to put our hands together, put our relationships together, put our social capital together, and do these in little pods throughout the country to start seeing some change and affecting change with the families and the advisors. So appreciate your time. Next month on September 23rd, we are going to be having a friend and a mentor of mine, Richard Harris. He is the chair of Trust and Estates magazine. He's the chair of their insurance committee. Brilliant. And we're going to be discussing from a legacy perspective, how do we take technical, combine it with purposeful, and create something that's very powerful. And one of the things that we're going to be discussing is strategies as we come to year end for families that can help them perpetuate legacy through some really advanced planning. And then how do we merge that with the legacy side of it and the purposeful side of it? So you want to join us? That's next month, September 23rd. For those of you that are already who are already logged in and registered for it, you'll get reminders every month. But we appreciate you. Thank you guys for today. You did a phenomenal job. I got to tell you, I sat back and just took notes, mental notes. I'm writing things down on a piece of paper. You guys are awesome, and just glad to be on this journey together with all of you. Guys, have a great day. God bless you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure.